Well, welcome to Chapter 15, White Collar Crime, Cybercrime, and Commercial Crime here at our advancement through criminal law at Wake Tech for the spring of 2024. And good morning to you, or good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time you're watching this slide. This is kind of a broad-ranging topic under the law when we talk about white-collar crime. There's going to be quite a bit in it. It's a lot of fraud that we're going to be looking at, but also some other commercial crimes. And of course, as once nowadays, everybody's got to throw the term cyber in whenever they're discussing something. Although I think currently the term that's replacing that is everyone's got to throw AI in when they're talking about anything. But we will address some of those issues. There's not a lot that's unique about a cybercrime versus others, but we'll take a look at them. All right, so moving on, we've got our learning objectives, as I said before, and some of these not really critical for students to look at. They really are just an overarching idea of what we're hoping to instill in the students for the chapter. All right, so what is white-collar crime? I did use that term. Well, it is, your book says it suggests, in fact, it kind of defines that the person committing the crime is not blue collar. Now, this goes way back, and I was speaking with this with my seated class, and they kind of didn't know the origin of this back in the, I would say, 1900s to about 1970 or so. Pretty much everyone that worked in an office or a bank, an insurance company, would wear a white dress shirt with a collar. So when we talk about a white collar crime, we're talking about someone that's working in that type of environment. As opposed to a blue collar, the connotation there was someone who worked in a factory or in a mechanic's shop would wear a denim or a blue shirt, not a white shirt. So when we talk about white collar crime, we're talking about that the person committing it is in a position, an economic position where most of his work is, I guess you could say, intellectual in a certain sense. Typically, these are people who work in business, own businesses, work for other businesses, and they are committing a type of financial crime. Very rarely is white-collar crime a crime of violence, although it can certainly have detrimental physical aspects to it. When we talk about white-collar crimes, we say you are solely motivated by economic gain. And the broadest category, I guess, that under classical criminal law that you would talk about here would be fraud. And fraud is essentially lying to someone in order to get their property away from them. And you can lie in all sorts of different ways. You can present falsehoods to get them to rely upon them. And so most of these white-collar crimes, these crimes of fraud, are based upon deceit, lying to someone, misrepresentation, showing them something claiming is true, which is essentially a lie, violation of trust, and they are more than street crimes, more than a lot of the crimes we looked at so far. These are crimes that are clearly premeditated. It's almost impossible to commit accidental embezzling. It can be done, but I mean, if it was truly accidental, and if you recognized it and turned yourself in, hard to see how it's a crime. Very frequently, white-collar crime charges, bank fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, another term we'll look at, are used to convict white-collar criminals, but also criminals that are doing other things, often violent things, but then are trying to hide the money from taxes, hide the money from being reported so they know that they robbed the bank, say. Classic example there is Al Capone, the famous gangster in Chicago, almost 100 years ago in the 1920s, would kill people, ran a bootlegging operation, extortion, racketeering, and what they convicted him, of course, was income tax fraud. So here are some of your common white-collar types of crimes that we can talk about. You'll notice the largest category there is that fraud category. That's about 63%. And then you've got some of the other ones. You've got larceny or theft. which can be a white-collar crime. That could be, I guess, something like shoplifting in this instance is potentially a white-collar crime. Embezzlement, white-collar crime. Forgery, bribery, tax evasion, money laundering, again, counterfeiting, and racketeering and extortion. All of these are your white-collar crimes as we look at them. It is by far economically, without talking about the human cost, economically the most serious type of crime we have. So if you look at the total value of crime, okay, so if you look at the far end of this chart where it says total value of stolen property, that would be things that were stolen from someone's wallet, or someone was beat up in a bar and they took their ring or their watch. And you can see that that's serious. I mean, it's 25, 35, $50 billion, maybe $30 billion. But then if you look at wage theft, you look at white-collar crimes, you look at high-collar estimates of white-collar crime, you look at total spending and tax evasion, you'll notice that the high-end estimate of white-collar crime, which is $600 billion a year, dwarfs by a factor of more than 10 the total value of stolen property and the kind of street crime that we talk about. So economically, this is by far, without question, the most serious type of crime. And yet, it is something that we devote a tenth of the resources to. If you go to the big cities in the United States, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, you're going to have homicide divisions, you're going to have burglary divisions, you're going to have people that concentrate on these street crimes. You're not going to have a lot of people that are focused on white-collar crime. There's going to be a few fraud divisions and things like that, but they're going to get a fraction of the criminal justice spending. Okay, so I've thrown around fraud quite a bit, and we will distinguish in a minute in North Carolina civil from criminal fraud, but what does fraud mean? It's deceit, which is essentially a lie. Deceitful means or acts used to cheat a person, a corporation, or governmental entity. So basically, you are getting money from somebody when we talk about cheating them, or a service potentially. So goods or services, but most of the time money. And you're doing this by lying. So it could be, let's suppose, fraud against the government. It could be claiming, well, I'm disabled, so give me a disability payment. That's fraud. It could be an insurance scam. Oh, I had this MRI done, pay my doctor, who's going to kick me back a percentage of this MRI that was never done. In order to prosecute, it has to be shown that it was intended. This is an intentional crime. Fraud is never committed, almost never, but we'll say never committed by accident. Most important frauds are violations of federal law. The reason for that is they often involve the banking system, which is regulated by the federal government, or they cross state lines, particularly if they're large scale. Criminal laws are in place that target white-collar crimes of fraud. We've created a number of these crimes to prosecute, or laws against these crimes. The question is, of course, how much energy do we divert to investigate and prosecute them? Okay, so I had mentioned that there's really civil and criminal fraud. So what's the difference? Well, criminal fraud in North Carolina, we're talking about, is prosecuted by the state of North Carolina, or more accurately, the attorneys in the districts. Usually these are in the larger cities, the counties, will prosecute you for criminal fraud. And it can be things like unfair or deceptive trade practices, and sometimes these can be treble the damages of what you stole. Now, civil fraud is not prosecuted by the government, but by private parties. So essentially, civil fraud, you're suing someone. Now, not all civil fraud is serious enough or involves the same issues that it is also criminal fraud. The major point of civil fraud is to get the money back. The major point of criminal fraud is to put the guy who committed it in jail or prison. So very often as an attorney, you might advise someone, yeah, someone committed fraud against you. They cheated you out of some money. But if someone comes in my office and says, this contractor committed fraud against me and he stole $50, I would say that's terrible. You're right. He committed civil fraud, but there's no point suing because you're going to spend more money because you have to pay for me, your attorney, to sue for you. On the other hand, criminal fraud can be prosecuted for any amount. You can go after people. So what are the elements of fraud in North Carolina? You have to make a false representation. If you tell the truth, it's never fraud. So if I'm selling you some sort of, fake medicine, but I say, hey, this medicine's never been tested by the FDA, it's never been evaluated, there's no evidence that it is effective at anything, then you have made a false representation. So after you make this representation, you have to tell someone about it. Now, obviously, these two things kind of go together. The third thing is you have to know it's fake or false when you make the representation. If you believe it to be true, then it's not fraud. So if I sell you a pill and I believe it lowers your blood pressure, but in fact, after they study it for a while, it turns out it's really not that effective. It doesn't really lower blood pressure. But when you prescribed it as a doctor or sold it as a pharmacist, you thought it did. It's not fraud. So you lie, you know it's a lie, and you try to get the person you're lying to, this is you are trying to induce the individual to rely, you're trying to get them to rely upon what you said that was false. Hey, this pill lowers blood pressure. They take the pill, and because they do that, they're injured. Now you might say, well, let's suppose I just sold you a sugar pill. There's nothing in the pill, but I sold it to you, and the result was your blood pressure wasn't injured, right? Well, you are injured because if you think about it, by relying upon you, I didn't go out and seek real treatment for my high blood pressure. So I am injured by it. Or it could be that the pill you gave me caused a reaction. So one of the ways I like to examine fraud at first, the elements of criminal fraud, is just in this medical context, which is not unusual at all. You make a false representation. You publish this representation. You know it's false when you say it. You're trying to get people to rely upon it, and they do. You sell someone a fake medicine. You tell them that it's going to cure their problem. You know it won't cure the problem. They reasonably rely upon you, and as a result, they don't seek treatment. All of these are the elements of fraud in North Carolina. Now, one of the most serious is bank fraud. Most banks, credit unions, any sort of financial institutions are insured by the federal government. And what that means, of course, is if a bank fails, if a big bank like Wells Fargo or Truist Bank fails or something, the federal government will come in and will make sure that every depositor that has money in that bank up to a certain amount gets their money back. So the federal government has a real vested interest to make sure that bank stays, solvent. So one of the things that the federal government does is they make sure that banks aren't ripped off or aren't ripping other people off at the same time. It requires, if you're being charged with bank fraud, that you knowingly execute, and again, this is an intentional act, a scheme or artifice, which basically means a plot or a plan, where you're trying to defraud a bank. So examples of this can improve check forgery, check kiting, false statements on loan applications, unauthorized use of an ATM, credit, debit fraud, or student loan. Now, notice that under bank fraud, I don't have to show the bank was harmed. You just have to try to do it. If you write a fake check and you walk into a bank and they don't cash it, you can't say, well, you can't prosecute me because you didn't lose any money. Well, you tried to cheat me. Again, if you made a false statement on a loan application, and famously going on right now, this has been happening. If you went in and said, you should loan me money at X percent, say 2%, because I'm a really good credit risk, here's all the assets that I have. And the bank looks and it says, well, normally we'd lend it to you at 4%, so we would make X amount of money. But since you've got all these assets, we'll lend you at 2% because it's a good loan. Or conversely, yeah, we feel good lending you the money because if we need to, we can collect against these assets. So the loan is secured. But if I've lied to you, if I've presented a false application, then either I'm getting a rate which is lower than I should have gotten, right? So I'm cheating the bank out of money. Or if the bank has to foreclose on the loan, there's no assets to get, and result is the bank loses money. In both those cases, the taxpayer, if they have to bail out the bank, loses money. All right, so the federal bank fraud is generally found under United States Code, Title 18, Section 1344, knowingly defrauding a financial institution by scheme or artifice to obtain money, funds, credit, asset, security, or other property under the control of said institution. The penalties are fairly severe, up to $1 million, depending upon loss, and or 30 years in prison if convicted. Now, here's the interesting thing, this next slide. As I said, this type of fraud is very, very damaging to society. More money is stolen with a pen than with a gun by far. But we're not prosecuting this very often. If you look at the number of white-collar crime prosecutions in the United States, they peaked right around in the 1990s. There was another little peak in the 2012 or so, but then they just fell off the cliff. And we really stopped prosecuting them, such that now that they're down around $4,000 or $5,000 from 4,000 or 5,000 prosecutions, from a high of 10 or 12,000, so they're a third. If this had happened to, say, murder, and these numbers are roughly the number of kind of prosecutorial murders that could exist. Is about it varies by jurisdiction, but if you thought, okay, there were 25,000 murders in the United States and we prosecuted 12,000, and now we're only prosecuting 4,000, people would be really angry. Well, this is what's happened. One of the biggest areas of fraud is healthcare fraud. So the largest single sector of the American economy is the medical sector. It dwarfs everything else in spending. And if you think about this, this makes sense. Medicare, Medicaid, those are two things, and we'll distinguish between those in a minute, federally. And then you have all your state programs, and then you have all your private insurance programs. You have all your hospitals, all these are just huge. So as a single sector, the healthcare sector for spending in the United States is just one of the largest, if not the largest sector. So part of this is run by the federal government, part of it by the federal government through the states, part of it is private. So false claims to the federal government cost the federal government huge amounts of money every year. So, for example, let's suppose that you have an imaging, a doctor's office, we'll say, that has an MRI machine. And they charge $1,000 to the federal government every time someone on Medicare, that'd be a senior, comes in to get an MRI. Great. A guy comes in and says, look, I'm a little short this month. You've got this MRI machine. How about you tell the federal government that you did an MRI. They kick you back the amount of money, $1,000. You give me half and you keep half and you don't do the MRI. So you don't spend any money and you get $1,000 back. That's fraud. So there can be Medicaid false claim statutes where you're claiming something that you're not entitled to. There can be Medicaid anti-kickback where you're getting a refund, or there can be flat-out healthcare fraud. So I use the terms Medicare and Medicaid. Let's distinguish between those quickly. And take these numbers with a grain of salt because they're going to change quite a bit. Medicare is socialized medical coverage for everyone over the age of 85. Now, I know the kind of stereotypical old person in the United States rails against socialism and the government giving stuff to people, but the biggest group that receives stuff from the government is old people, and they get it through Medicare and Social Security. And what it is essentially, it is health insurance for people over the age of 65. Once you are over the age of 65 in the United States, you qualify for Medicare. You no longer need to have private insurance. There's no means test. So you could be Bill Gates, the owner of Microsoft, or Elon Musk, the owner of Tesla. You're still at age 65 entitled to claim under Medicare. Now, if you have a disability, if you are totally disabled, suppose you're in a terrible accident, you're quadriplegic and you can't work and you have no money, you can qualify early for this. It is solely a federal program. Now, Medicaid is for poor people, and there's huge fights about this. It's offered by the federal government, but it's kind of co-managed or runs through, depending upon the different kind of types of it, through the different state governments. And it is most commonly for poor people in the United States. Now, those numbers are rough numbers that have changed. But basically, if an individual earns less than $20,000, or if a family earns less than $35,000, they could qualify for Medicaid. We also have various kind of fill in the gap things we could talk about, where we talk about Obamacare, where you get a subsidized quasi-private insurance. Again, it can trigger the fraud statutes. Now, North Carolina has numerous Medicaid frauds because, as I said, they run Medicaid, which is for the poor, through the states. So you have fraudulent application by a provider, and this provider is basically the doctor or the service. Concealment of fact affecting the provider's eligibility, fraud by the medical assistants, get rid of that, obstructing the investigation of a medical assistance provider, soliciting or receiving a kickback, or offering or paying a kickback. All those are crimes in North Carolina. Those are the ones we charge the doctors with. Very often, that's where the real money is. You can have an individual who comes in, the doctor says, hey, I'm going to prescribe this drug for you. It's very expensive. You can take it or not. I don't care. But Medicaid is going to pay $1,000. And I'm going to get $500, so I'll give you $100 of it. So you'll be getting a kickback. And the doctor there would be chargeable. Now, the next thing to talk about is intellectual property fraud. 50, 100 years ago, the vast value in society was of things. Steel mills, railroads, automobile plants. The real money was there. Now, most of the top 100 corporations in the United States don't so much own physical things as control property. So if you think about companies like Netflix, they have the rights to broadcast things. If you think about Microsoft, they have the right to sell you software. If you think about most large companies, what they're selling you, I guess classic example, is sometimes an object, but the real value is the cost behind that object to make it, to intellectually create it. So think about an iPhone. An iPhone can cost you hundreds and hundreds of dollars, but it only costs pennies per dollar to manufacture. The real value is, well, what did it cost for us to develop this? What was our industrial research cost? And what people quickly think about is, well, you might have made this. Let's take some of these new diet pills, this medication, which is extremely expensive, that seems to be effective at fighting obesity. I believe I'm not sure, I think it's Novartis that makes it. Well, they put in a lot of money of research, they did tests, and they come up with this formulation that, if taken by an individual, will help them lose weight. Well, great. To make that first pill, it cost this drug company hundreds of millions of dollars. Now they can make that pill for 5 cents. And they're going to sell it to the general public, though, for $1,000 or whatever they can get, because they're first going to recover all the money for that intellectual work, and then they're going to make a profit. Now, of course, unscrupulous people might say, well, I can copy that, right? I can take what you've done and I can simply copy that pill. And the same thing can happen for inventions like pills, artistic works like, maybe a big album just came out by Jelly Bean or something like that, and someone just pirates a copy of it. So these tend to be protected by intellectual property law. So one of the big ones is the Copyright Act, and it's going to protect things like books, movies, and songs once they've been published. So if you steal the use or you sell something that doesn't belong to you, that somebody else created, you can be sentenced up to 5 years in prison. Then you can infringe, which is distributing it. Now, sometimes this can be fair use. One of the things that happens is you might have something that is copyrighted or protected. So take a recent movie like, say, Oppenheimer. And obviously that is copyrighted. Right now it's being shown, I believe, on Peacock. But let's suppose as a professor, I wanted to show, I was teaching a course on the media and science. And I wanted to show a scene from that in my classroom. Well, under the fair use doctrine, because it is scholarship, research, teaching, and the classroom, I could use that without paying them. It would not be intellectual property fraud. Then, of course, we have trade secrets, where if you have some sort of secret, we can make it a crime to steal that if it's part of your trade. Perhaps the most famous example here is the formula for Coca-Cola or Pepsi. All right, contract fraud and the False Claims Act. So the federal government makes thousands of contracts with providers every year. So does the state governments, and states have something similar. We'll look at that in a minute. To submit bills, file claims. If you fraudulently submit a false claim, knowing it to be false, you've committed a crime. Basically, you're going to the federal government and saying, hey, you know that hurricane that came through here? It destroyed my house and I lost $100,000. When in fact, a couple shingles blew off your house and you suffered maybe $1,000 loss. Well, if you filed for $100,000 with the FEMA, you're part of false claims at this point. And this, of course, will cover everything from defense contractors to people even doing janitorial services in federal buildings. It also can apply to income tax fraud. Now, North Carolina has a False Claim Act, and it basically says it's unlawful for any person to knowingly, again, this is an intentional, present a fraudulent claim to the state of North Carolina using a false record, making a false statement, or a false claim, including the misuse of state property entrusted to them. And what you're trying to do in North Carolina is rip them off. All right, then we have program frauds. Again, federal programs like Medicaid, Medicare, what used to be called food stamps, and has gone through a number of different names, Social Security, and various AIDS programs are victims of frauds every year. Most of these are covered by that False Claim Act. We also have the Federal Program Theft Act, where people knowingly defraud money from organizations they represent that receive substantial monies. Congress also, because we spend so much money on healthcare, has passed various statutes, including the healthcare fraud statute, to make any scheme or artifice if you file a false statement to claim any type of federal health benefit, if made, again, knowingly and willfully. All right, moving away just a little bit from fraud, we have the bribery statutes. What is bribery? And again, we'll look at some specifics in North Carolina, but bribery is offering a gift or payment to another with the specific intent to obtain something lawfully. And when we say that, we usually use a Latin term. And again, this is not the best pronunciation of Latin, but quid pro quo literally means this for that. You give something of value to receive something. So bribery is, I give you a gift or payment to get something that I shouldn't have gotten. Now, there's two people involved in this crime there. We don't tend to think of it, but let's suppose I'm a building contractor and I need my building inspected before I can get paid. So I go to the town planning commission and I go to the building inspector and say, hey, come out today. I will give you $500 to inspect my property, even though I'm not entitled to have it inspected for another month. And I'll pay another $500 if you like, if you pass it. The guy comes out and he takes the $1,000 and fails the property. Says, oh no, it's not good enough. He's still in this bribery scheme. Even if you do something that doesn't benefit another person, if you take the money that's an illegal fee, that's going to be your bribery and extortion. It does require that you show that the official agreed to use their position for this payment. Now, let's look at North Carolina's. North Carolina has offering bribes. This is a Class F felony. To offer a bribe, whether it's accepted or not, to a public official. You get pulled over by a police officer, you wrap a $100 bill around your license when you handed it to him. That's offering a bribe. It's Class F felony. And it can be, even if he still writes you the ticket, you're still chargeable. Or if he writes you a ticket for a lesser amount, you're still chargeable. We've also got North Carolina General Statute 4217, covers anyone in government accepting anything in return for performing or not performing something of their job, either not giving you the ticket or coming out inspecting your property early, were examples. All right, stock market and financial frauds. This is heavily federalized. We have the Securities and Exchange Act. We actually have some major legislation from the 1930s. But basically it makes it a crime to use a manipulative or deceptive device or contrivance in connection with the purchase or sale of security. It covers things like insider trading, where you have information about a company and you buy or sell it based upon that, and you shouldn't have it. Inventing fake companies with fake assets, or giving the public misleading or false information. Using it, if it's not available to the public, is your crime there. So let's suppose you work for a company, ABC Incorporated, and you know that they just discovered a cure for cancer. So you run out and you buy 100,000 shares of the stock. Well, the general public didn't know this. So people that sold you that $100,000 share thought the stock was worth one amount of money. You knew, because you had information that no one else was privileged to, that it was worth far more. Therefore, you cheated him. Wire and mail fraud, as I said, any person who uses the U.S. mail or interstate wires, which is going to include telephones, faxes, and it's going to include the internet, as part of a fraudulent scheme or artifice. Now, it's got to be for the purposes of. And very often what we're doing is someone comes in and tries to extort money. You know, everybody has gotten scam phone calls. You're under this statute. So what they want you to do is they want you to transfer money to them. And it might be go out and buy a gift card and then transfer it to me. Or it might be give me access to your bank account so I can, check it for you or something. All that would be under wire and mail fraud. Identity theft, not something that's completely new. This has been around forever. There was a movie made in the 1950s, for God's sakes, called The Great Pretender, with Tony Curtis, about a guy who stole people's identities. And this was right around the Korean War. He actually pretended at one point to be a dentist and wound up serving in, I think it was the Canadian Navy, by stealing this dentist identification. Then he pretended to be a prison warden, got a job as a prison warden. So identity theft is stealing a person's identification and or just creating a fictitious person, a synthetic identity. It's both a federal and state crime. Now, if you knowingly use identifications belonging to another, that can be aggravated identity theft for federally. Very often that person's ID you're stealing doesn't even have to be alive. So one of the classic things you do, if you're creating a synthetic identity, for example, or if you're creating a false identity, is you go to the death certificates, you find someone that was born approximately the time you were, but is deceased, very often as a baby, and then you start applying for identification in that person's name, pretending it's you. So North Carolina's identity theft, North Carolina 14113.20, You obtain, possess, or use another's identifying information, could be a state ID, could be a driver's license, with the intent to use fraudulently to present yourself as that person, and doing so in a financial transaction, obtaining something of value or avoiding legal consequences. And you could face up to almost, 4 years in prison, 47 months. So if we look at identity theft, breaking it down, what is it? People do it mainly to access credit card accounts, but it can be to get to bank accounts, to obtain loans, to commit telephone fraud, employment fraud, to get a driver's license, Social Security, or fraudulent tax. That could be an illegal alien coming in or an undocumented alien coming in to get a fake Social Security card. Usually the victim does not have a direct relationship with the suspect, but it can happen. The average amount that is obtained is about $7,000. The average expense to the victim is about $1,000. So this is a major, major crime. And an individual in the United States is far more likely to suffer loss here than if they are in a mugging. Trust me, the numbers there are much smaller. Counterfeiting money and commercial products. The only entity that is entitled to issue actual fiat money, which is the green bills that you have in your wallet or purse, is the federal government. The Treasury can issue coins and the Federal Reserve can issue bills. Basically, all counterfeit crimes, therefore, are federal crimes. It is a crime to create counterfeit bills, to knowingly possess them, or to pass them. Now, knowingly possess them, you have to possess them with the intent to do something bad, but you basically have to be ready to pass them. Counterfeiting includes other products. Theoretically, you can counterfeit, say, designer goods like a Gucci bag. And if you import, you manufacture, or sell a counterfeit product, you can be prosecuted federally as well. That is a major issue. Cybercrime, as I said, someone's got to slap this label on crimes to keep people interested and pretend to be hip. So cybercrime, basically something implemented through a computer. And pretty much every type of crime we're talking about here was committed by other means before. We're just kind of juicing it up by using a computer. So one of the things that is a little bit unique is computer trespass. Unlawful access to a computer system with the intent to commit a crime, or unlawful access to a computer system maintained by the government for the purposes of stealing information, altering data, or damaging the computer. North Carolina has some felony cybercrimes as well. These are your felonies, and we'll look at our misdemeanors in a second. You alter, damage, or destroy a government computer. It's a felony. You use a computer to steal more than $1,000. Felony. You essentially, this is usually you put a virus or you deny the use of a government computer without authorization. You extort using a computer, or you commit trespass on a computer. You go in and you damage it somehow, very often the database. There's a felony there. And then I guess first degree child pornography is a felony in North Carolina. That's possession, distribution, ownership, production. Your misdemeanors with computers could be accessing it to change a test score. So warning my students, if you could break into my computers and change your grade, that is a crime in North Carolina. Computer trespass, that's just going in even if you don't do anything. Cyberbullying, if the defendant's 18-year-old, or cyberbullying if the defendant's under 19, so under 18. One of the catch-alls that they threw in this chapter, kind of strangely enough, is arson. And we'll talk about this. Arson used to be viewed very seriously. It was a capital offense in the pre-industrial world, really, because if you burn down someone's house in medieval England when the common law is developing, they're going to die when the winter comes. So burning down a house was very serious. So it was punishable by death. Now, obviously, it's less serious, even though it's very dangerous. Arson is the deliberate, willful, malicious, and malice being ill will or hatred, burning of a building or personal property, and the degree depends upon what type of building you burned. So we have first degree arson, which is burning or using an explosive on a building where people are there, and then we have second degree where no one's home. And these are the federal statutes. The United States has arson statutes making it a federal crime to malicious damage by fire or explosives, any property, um, even beyond arson. So what's North Carolina's? We've got first-degree arson and second-degree arson. So first-degree arson, again, this is a fairly serious crime. You're looking at multiple years in prison. You burn the home, dwelling house, of another while it's occupied intentionally, not by accident, not that you were smoking and fell asleep on the couch, but intentionally, first-degree arson. Second-degree arson is identical to that, but nobody's home. Serious, but we want to make it less serious because you're not endangering people's lives. Although, be aware that if a firefighter comes and dies fighting a fire, that this could trigger the murder felony rule in North Carolina, which says if you kill someone during the commission of a felony, it's a first-degree murder charge. So you could commit second-degree arson. You could be which is a felony. You could be burning someone's house, maybe for profit, even your own house, theoretically. And the fire department gets called, and a firefighter gets overcome by smoke and dies. That goes from something that might be punishable by 4 or 5 years in prison to first-degree murder, which theoretically we could execute you for. Product tampering, excuse me. The crime of consumer product tampering receives a lot of attention. It can be used as a bait of extortion or to threaten companies. Federal statutes exist, and most states make it a crime to tamper with evidence of a crime, to tamper with a financial document. Then we have specific laws in North Carolina about, and other states, about tampering with the odometer, which measures the miles of a motor vehicle, or tampering with a witness or potential witness by telling them what to say or what not to say. All of these are criminal acts. So what are some of the ones in North Carolina to look at? We've got food tampering, which is 14-401-11. Distribution of certain foods or beverages are prohibited. Any noxious substance that causes physical discomfort, any controlled substance, or any poison or object that is placed into a food is product or food tampering. The penalty is based upon the injury. If you were to kill someone, arguably I guess in theory it could be a first-degree murder charge. But if you seriously injured them, it's certainly a felony. Then we've got that odometer tampering. Now you notice this is not in Chapter 14, it's Chapter 20. That's the motor vehicle statutes in North Carolina. So it's Chapter 20-343. It's unlawful to disconnect an odometer, to reset it, or alter it. And that's why when you buy and sell cars, you have to swear that you didn't do that when you sign over title, with the intent to change the number of miles. Now, if you disconnected it because it was on fire, different story. It's Class I felony, and there are civil damages up to 3 times the difference. So if you sold the car claiming there was 20,000 miles on it when there was 200, I could sue you for 3 times the difference or $1,500, whichever was greater. So the minimum you're going to get charged with civilly would be $1,500. All right, now witness tampering, we'll look at this in evidence tampering, but witness tampering, North Carolina General Statute 14266A, so we're back in the criminal statutes of 14s. By threat, menace, which basically is a threat, or any manner or intimidation or attempt, you try to get a witness who's been summoned or acting as a witness in any state court to prevent or attempt to prevent them coming in. That's witness tampering. It's a Class G felony. So it basically, are you trying to get a witness not to testify against you? Do you say, oh, here's a free ticket to Hawaii, go on vacation that week when I'm on trial? You'd be under witness tampering in North Carolina. It's Class G felony. Multiple years in prison if proven. All right, the last slide to look at is evidence tampering. So, not a crime I don't recall of seeing charged, but it certainly exists under statute. North Carolina General Statute 14221.1. You alter, destroy, or steal. So what? First of all, you do this by entering, breaking any building, structure, or vehicle or file where evidence relevant to a criminal offense or proceeding is kept. It's a Class I felony. So I guess the Easiest way to think about this one would be you break into the evidence room in a sheriff's department or in a police department and you destroy something. You'd be chargeable. I just watched a documentary on Netflix about a evidence technician in Massachusetts who was charged with testing the purity of drugs. What she did was she used the drugs herself. So she was smoking the crack in the evidence room and then reporting how much it was. She would be chargeable with tampering of evidence. Notice she didn't have to necessarily steal it. She just altered it and by consuming it, destroyed it. It's a Class I felony. Something that's chargeable in North Carolina. I haven't seen this, I don't recall, but it's certainly a chargeable offense. All right, when you're done, you can move on to our next chapter. We've got 16, 17, 18, 19, and a little bit of North Carolina specifics included. Have a happy morning, afternoon, or evening, and I will see you in the next chapter, or you may hear me in the next chapter.